Today for Devotions with Daniela, we are reading White Women Get Ready, How Healing from Post-Traumatic Mistress Syndrome Leads to Anti-Racist Change. I'm working through this book on my own. If you're interested in doing the work with me, you can get signed copies attached here. This is chapter 3, The Labor of Labor. And let's remember, cults are always about labor. And then they met, the offspring of sky women and the children of Eve. And the land around us bears the scars of that meeting, the echoes of our stories. They say that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and I can only imagine the conversation between Eve and Sky Woman. Sister, you got the short end of the stick. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. When teaching kids to tie shoes, I tend to stick to the bunny ears method. However, when left to my own devices, I prefer a more complex loop, swoop, and pull knot. As an adult, it's amazing how I do this without even thinking. I make that quick grab with one hand for a loop on the lace to my right. My left hand reaches for my right lace loop. At the same time, the fingers on my right hand make contact with the left lace, guiding it through the gap. In one motion, both hands pull the two symmetrical loops taut. As the initial knot of patriarchy was secured, the loop, swoop, and pull of mercantilism and colonialism took hold. A predecessor to contemporary capitalism, mercantilism developed alongside that of the male-headed nation state, as European governments promoted policies that would maximize their accumulation of wealth, of resources, of land, of control, of people, while competing with other European state powers in a zero-sum quest for global rule. Mercantilism was marked by government actions such as high tariffs, subsidizing exports, and the charter of trade companies such as the British East India Company in 1600 and the Dutch East India Company in 1602, forerunners to today's multinational corporations. Before the modern-day stock exchange and globalization, before free trade and imperialism, before the Industrial Revolution and chattel slavery, mercantilism promoted the tenets of domination and exploitation that had previously been codified at home as European nation-states began to tyrannize the globe. A few years into my first real job, the Peace and Justice nonprofit gig, I was interviewed by a filmmaker for a film about labor. He was focusing on the food service industry, which is one of the ways children are heavily trafficked. Funny about that word labor, I said, how it is used for both childbirth and work that earns a wage. The first definition required for the latter. I could tell by the kind but slightly puzzled look on his face that the interview wasn't going as planned. My reflections on midwifery and childbirth at the advent of capitalism were not interfacing with his story arc of the lives of Pittsburgh's dishwashers and line cooks. His film was grounded in the 100-year-plus lineage of Pittsburgh Union base, but not necessarily in the several hundred-year history of the devaluation of feminization of reproductive labor. I'm guessing he was knowledgeable about the steelworkers and the Homestead strike, but probably hadn't considered how criminalization of 16th century European women's reproductive control aligned with their exclusion from wage labor and craft guilds, and what that had to do with 21st century labor organizing. I was newly learning this information too. The not real work. During early mercantilism, as land was privatized and the commons lost, working class men gained increasingly free access to women's bodies, their labor, and the bodies and labor of their children. As Federici also notes, the devaluation of work done by women at this time was sanctioned by both guilds and the state. Local governments instructed craft guilds to overlook the production that women, especially widows, did in their home because it was not real work. As a result, the at-home work that kept humans healthy and alive, the labor that brought humans into the world, nurtured and fed the bodies of laborers, supported mental and emotional well-being, and maintained relational and social ties, was both devalued and rendered invisible. This devaluation of and feminization of reproductive labor also created a market class for women to perform reproductive labor for the ruling class, albeit at the lowest rates. Outsourcing such reproductive work meant that most labor done by poor women was not for their own families, but for employers. Of course, low pay would not be the case for millions of enslaved women, for whom forced reproductive labor went hand in chain with enslavement. The extraction of reproductive labor in Europe set the tone for the horrific exploitation of reproductive labor under colonialization and enslavement. Scholar Jennifer L. Morgan speaks specifically to the theft of African women's reproductive lives in Laboring Women, Reproduction and Gender in New World Slavery. The crucial matter of hereditary and the permanent mark of racial inferiority situated enslaved women's reproductive identity at the heart of the matter in ways not always explicated by slave owners and their visible archives. Women's lives under slavery in the Americas always included the possibility of their wombs. In retrospect, we can see how one knot led to another, how the denigration of one's own mother and her labor readied the denigration of another's. Once the acts of reproduction had been deemed the segregated work of women, once the concept of wage labor had been separated from women's reproductive work and depreciated and invisibilized at home, how seamlessly the collective colonizer psyche shifted to the unpaid reproductive labor of peoples it judged inferior.